What's good, guys? Today we're going to be looking at making subbasses. So my approach to making subbasses is generally using SERUM and using the wavetable editor or some distortion to create harmonics on a fundamental sine wave as my sub. So to get that fundamental sort of sine wave, for starters here, right in the 0 region, so we got F0, so we're right into MIDI there, and drop a SERUM onto your channel. So if we initialize the patch, open up a basic shapes and leave that on a sine wave, and we play that out. You would want to be having span and a Uline loudness meter. These are both free plugins, the main monitoring plugins for your frequency distribution and leveling, and then for your overall loudness of the track or for the individual elements. So go download those, and also look up on YouTube how to set up span for mid-side, just mid-side span essentially. Look up that on YouTube and get that set up. So with those all done, we want to hop in and I'll play that. So you can see when we play at 0, somewhere between C0 up to C1, so we're on F0, our SERUM, without even changing anything, without even changing any of the octaves and stuff, we have a sub there. That is essentially all a sub is. It's a sine wave, one fundamental. Now if we open up the wavetable editor in SERUM, so we click on this, that bin there, right there, that's essentially what your sine wave is. It's one harmonic, one frequency, and it's being played here. You can see if I drop that down and put one up further up, you can see our frequency increases. And now we're up here, where we go down. And you can have multiple. So if we drop all that back, we have nothing. And we'll write our sub back in. What we want to do is we also want to create audibility across not just a system that can play the sub, because you're going to be listening through a lot of headphones and you're going to be listening through laptop speakers and all this other sort of stuff, iPhone speakers. So we need to add in harmonics, and these harmonics not only do that, but they add drive, and our ears perceive these harmonics. They could just listen to the harmonics and you would know what your sub frequency or your key of your sub is meant to be in. Now, as we do these, there's a few different ways. So the traditional way of doing them is to just put some distortion on the sub. So you can see as we drive it up. Now that would be way too much because we got nearly a full frequency or a full spectrum sound there. So something like that could be pretty good. And your different distortion modes, as you can see, create different harmonic spreads from the initial thing. Usually people just use tube. Now that's cool, but what I like to do is I like to add in the harmonics myself using the wavetable editor. So when you add in the harmonics, the first thing you got to know is that your fundamental, so this one, always is the highest. So we don't want something like that. We would want something like this. And then we maybe want a few more. Now, obviously, usually people associate subs with anything below 100. In reality, your fundamental harmonic sits somewhere between 0 and 60, usually. And it's the second harmonic that also sits around the 100 region. So if you cut your sub so it's just low passing it or high cutting, either way, you're only allowing anything below 100. You're actually allowing that second harmonic in there. And these harmonics here that sit, so your second, third, and fourth bins or harmonics, 2, 3, 4, fundamental being the first, they they are it's a difficult region to work in because a lot of people will tell you that it's the muddy region, which it is, but that's because a lot of stuff can build up there. It's the low end of your vocals and your synths, and it's or basses or mid basses, and it's the top end of your sub. And generally, your mid basses like growls and stuff like that, they're very heavily present in here. But it's a region that you need to get good at dealing with if you want to have a certain power and drive to your tracks. Now, if we drop this back here, I'm just going to leave this one. And I have a reference track, which is my remix of Triggerfinger. So I'm just going to play this. So you can see there that the fundamental it's hitting negative 26.2 dB. So it's just below this 24 dB or negative 24 dB line there. And then you can see we have pretty similar, like pretty high leveled of those next harmonics that are coming over. So if I wanted to make a sub like there is in my Triggerfinger track, what I would do is I would create those harmonics in SERUM, and then I would level them accordingly. Now, instead of using the sub, or oscillator 1, sorry, for the sub, I'm actually just going to use the actual sub there. So you'll see what happens when we do that. I don't need the loudness meter there. The backed-out sub. So we turn that off, got nothing, turn the sub on, same thing. It's just a sine wave at that 0 octave. So I'm going to level this up. And we can't really go any higher than that, so we can probably level our output actually. And now we're going to flick back and forth between the reference track and this one. Now how I do that is Command K or Control K, and you click on the solo button when you're in your key, your shortcut assigning tab or whatever you call this. I think it's this one here. And once you've clicked on that, I chose the open bracket, so you hit that key and then you Command K again. And now whenever I hit that key, it flicks to the reference track. Make sure the reference track is turned off so that it's not playing unless you solo it with that key command. And this will allow us to keep these windows open and not be flicking back and forth, so we can really fine tune and level. So if we look, drag this down a bit, just in case you can't see it. Now, I'm actually going to write this in D sharp. Or D. I think it might be in D. Yeah. So now we have it in the same key. It's just for the sake of how to reference. So I think we need a little bit more on this one. So we'll go back into SERUM and we will increase, the master's already up fully. So what we could do is, see, what happened was my tube distortion was still on. So that was actually cutting it off. So now if we look, yeah, now it's way out. So we need to bring that down actually. Maybe up a tad. Yeah, see, now your fundamental is looking just like that. So now we'll move on to the next ones. So we could turn on oscillator A for this. And instead of using that one, because that's already being taken by the sub oscillator, we'll do bin 2 now. So now, if we want to have a look at what this has done, But you see now this one's higher. We don't want that. So we're going to drop that down. So if we hover about the tip of that one, so we need to bring ours up a little bit. Oh, don't know what happened there. So that's pretty well leveled. Now we move on to the third one. So we can do that in this, but for the sake of this, I'll just say, let's start on oscillator B, analog, basic shapes, unassign, open the wavetable editor, and instead of 1, 2, we'll now go 3. So again, we don't want that. So you can see that third one is hitting at about this -36 line. And so is ours. And then it looks like there's another harmonic there. But what we can see, yeah, that one's sitting right down there. So when we get to this point, we're now at 150 hertz. Now, personally, I cut my subs off at 150. So it's a bit of a weird one, because do we want this harmonic to be taken by the bass, or do we want it to be taken by the sub? Personally, I think this sub, like this, with 3, I think that's more than enough. So now pretty much everything up to 150 hertz, so the first 3, your fundamental and your first 2 harmonics, that's been taken care of. That's leveled correctly. And you can see on the mid side, there's not a lot of side information going on. That side information there, I usually don't have any stereo information in the subs. Usually I'll keep it just all completely mono. Like I wouldn't have something like this, because that's all fine and well. But what happens is, we chuck a utility. When we mono that, aka what happens on big festival systems, because they can't do stereo on massive setups, we get phasing, which is what happens with Reese basses, but not the good type. So we don't want any stereo down there. So make sure they're all on mono, just one voice. Now, that side information is actually coming because I mastered this and then I sent it to TC and he pushed a little bit more. Him being... So, he knew a little bit more about me. But, for leveling, I now have a sub that's leveled. And when your sub is leveled correctly, you can level everything else around that. So if we look at the rest of the track, we can see for this that our high end is sitting a little bit above the sub, but at the generally the same area. So what we have is like, we have the sub, and then it dips down. And then we have the fundamental tone of that main sound. So like the buh, which is in that main bass. The most prominent tone of that bass is around 300 hertz. That is the fundamental tone. It's an important tone. So we allow this to be bigger. This doesn't have to keep going down in a big curve like that, because that actually gives the track a lot of tonality. And then you see we have a little bit more spread out. And then it dips back up to your highs. And then finally your super highs, which is your hats, essentially. Or noise and stuff, that sort of sits at the same level as the sub. In this case, the sub's a little bit dropped back. So what would happen now is if I was to make another SERUM and I was to make, like, let's say a saw. Well, actually, no, I won't do that. I'm going to drop down this Reese that I made. So this is a Reese bass that I made in the other thing. And you can see I've got the sub inbuilt in here. So I'm actually going to turn that off. And in the EQ, so I'm going to delete the whole sub layer. I'm actually going to remove the low cut. So if we just listen to that, now what are we looking at this? So let's say you dropped in a Reese bass sample or a preset, and the sub looks like this. Well, we have a lot of issues here. We have quite a bit of side information going on. And we have a lot of phasing happening because of the nature of how Reese basses are made, which is causing phasing between two different oscillators. And that's causing the sub to change level. Now that's okay, but the problem is we need a consistent sub. Any good track has a consistent sub. There are some exceptions, but usually when those exceptions work, they're exceptional producers, like Skrillex or something. So what we want to do is we want to replace this bass with our sub. We want to take the sub away from this Reese bass or this mid bass or this further up sound and replace it with our sub. But we need to do that in a way that doesn't take too much character out of the main bass and it carves space out for it. So if we look in, we solo the sub, our sub finishes at about 130, 150 hertz. It's actually 111 where that last one sits. So when we go into our main bass, into the Reese, we want to bring our EQ all the way up. I'll just put this here so you can see what I'm doing. So that's too high. We'll go down, down, watch the frequency here. So as you can see, this little dip here, so going from about 200 down to 100, a lot of the character of the Reese comes from there. See over here, it sounds like it sounds too thin. But down here, and that's because of this harmonic that's over here, this tone, which is that one there. So obviously a Reese bass in a low octave like this one is, being a deeper sort of sound, that is actually an important tone. So we don't want that tone to be overlapped and taken out by the sub, because what would happen is if we level the sub up to, let's say we take out that sort of region and then we turn our sub on, it sounds okay, but we find that it sort of sounds like there's a sub and then it sounds like there's a thin Reese on top. So what we might do, what we can do, is we turn off that upper harmonic. So now if we just solo the sub, we've actually turned off bin 3. So we just got 1 and 2. And now on our Reese, we will allow that area to come in. And now we turn our sub back on. And now we find that we have a thicker sort of Reese, but the issue is that the Reese, the tone on that Reese, that third harmonic here, the one that sits between 100 and 200, is now overpowering the sub. So if we look at the frequency spectrum there, we can definitely see that there's a lot of build-up between 2 to 6K. And that harmonic there is too overpowering. So there's a few things we can do. I personally would use Soothe for that, but because it's a lot more surgical. But if we wanted to use an EQ, I would add in another EQ8. This is the simpler way. And you can see I would drop that down, make a small Q value and drop it down. And then further up, we want to make another one, small Q value. Remember, fine movements, you don't need to go down. Even that little dip there is -4 dB. And we want to take it from about 2 to 6K, so maybe about 4K. Maybe make the Q a bit wider. And now what happens is that we have a well-balanced sub and mid bass, and the crossover point between them isn't causing too much issue. And that's something you guys have to decide for yourself. It's where you cut your mid bass off. So I'm cutting the mid bass off at about 111 hertz. So I'm letting through that sort of third area that originally was taken up by this. Now the sub just has the fundamental and the first harmonic. And then the Reese is everything above that. This little bit here, you don't have to worry too much about that. Another thing we could do is we could allow more through. But you see, that starts to cause phasing and issues with the sub there, so I'm going to take that away. We could also just level the Reese down a bit. It might be a bit too hot, so I'll turn down the output of the saturate. But in that case, we might not need as much of a drop here. Again, that's all stuff that is taste to your ears. And that's, unfortunately, EQing is just more time you spend EQing, the better you get at it. Now, as a last little thing, what we can do now is, so that we don't have to write the sub in all the time, we put all the stuff here in the group. So I'll put the EQ8 in there. So that's our Reese. And we go to our sub and we can drag we can copy. So Control C or Command C. And then we click in here and Control V. And now it drops that SERUM below the Reese. Make sure it's not in the actual Reese chain, that it's below it, makes its own chain, and then Command or Control R and go sub. And now, because the Reese and the sub were both written in D0, we now can just turn off the alone sub, because now that sub is a chain of its own in the Reese track. And you see, we get that there. So if I turn off the Reese now, if I turn off the sub, turn them both on. And now what happens is that now that we've got that nicely in level, we can go and say, okay, now we're going to write the melody. So and essentially, there's more I could go into, but that's all I'll do for now. That is how I approach leveling subs. So to recap, your sub is essentially a sine wave followed by harmonics, bins in SERUM, if you will. You can also make them by adding distortion. You can do a combination. You can add in one like that, and then you could also distort and see what that does. But essentially, we do that, we keep it mono, and then we find the point, the crossover point that's good. You know, maybe this is a further up sound. If we weren't writing in 0, let's say, and we were writing the Reese in D1, so I'm actually going to take the sub back out of that, because now we're writing the Reese in a higher octave. So we'll turn that sub back on. Now what you see is we have a bit of a crossover problem, because now the fundamental of the Reese is sitting up here near 300. So now we don't really need the 100 to 200 range to be taken up by the Reese. So what we can do is we go back into SERUM. So we'll solo the sub. Turn on that third harmonic, the one that sits in the third there. I can't remember if it's second or third, but there's the fundamental, I'm just saying, is the first. And then we go back into the Reese, and now we EQ that up. So we can take away this EQ now, because we're not, that's not going to apply as much. And we'll level this up, let's say, to about 250. See right there, that at 367, you're taking away that fundamental lower tone. So it's back down there. So 240 is pretty good. And then we apply the sub. But now we see there's still a gap. See between here. So we can add that in how we want. One way we could add that in is by duplicating the serum. So we control G to make it a chain and then control duplicate on the chain to make a second one. And in this second one, we turn off the sub and we turn off oscillator A. We go into oscillator B, and instead of writing it in bin 3, we do one in bin 4. So now what we've done effectively is we've added the fourth harmonic, which is that one there. And now what we've done is we filled the gaps and we turn them both on. We can level this down a bit. See, there we go. Then we don't have any big gaps. So without the sub, and then with it. Now that's cool, but again, we now need to write, because this is being written in D1 and this is in D0, we can't combine these. Now you could go into the Reese, into Serum, and you could drop everything, put everything up 1 octave. But then that's going to mess with the way that these are interacting, because obviously the Reese effect is dependent on the offset of the pitches, and the offset of the pitches works differently in relation to each other if they're at, you know, if this is at 0 or 1 and this is at 0 or 1 sort of thing. So I'm going to leave these separate, and then I'd have to write in the MIDI separately to write the melodies. But that's essentially what you want to do. It's about getting that fundamental tone, adding on the harmonics in a uniform fashion that drops down, so your fundamental is always the most powerful, and then figuring out what the crossover between that and your lower sounds is, or your basses, and figuring out where the fundamental of that bass is, the lower fundamental, and seeing where that sits to determine how many of the sub overtones that you want to allow through. Again, the reason that I use the wavetable editor is because I can individually, using the level here or the level here, precisely tune each fundamental, including the each harmonic, including the fundamental, which is your sub harmonic, differently of one another. Whereas if you were to just have a sub, so we do that, and we turn off this fourth one that we added later. So it's just back to this here. If we were to do the traditional way of adding distortion, what we find is not only has adding that distortion increased the level of our sub, not by a lot, so because we already had the sub pretty high, so we're pushing it up and it can't really push up any further. But what happens now is I can't individually level all of these. And you'll also notice that this second one hasn't come in now. Now we could add that by adding in the second bin there. But you see what happens is now, because we're not just running a sub through the distortion, we're running the sub plus the second harmonic through the distortion. It changes the way that the distortion interacts. See, that's a very uniform, clean distortion. That's a bit muddy. But if we do that without the distortion, and we add the other one in, that's clean. So then, yeah, really what I would recommend doing is duplicating that, and then in your second one, turn off your sub. We can make this bin 4. We can make this bin 5. And then we look at how those are leveled. They're pretty high, so I'm going to drop them down. And that's the fundamentals of how I make subs. Hope that helped you guys. I'll see you in the next one.